Thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce Antonio Vazquez-Arroyo from Rutgers University. Antonio is an old and dear friend, a young but old dear friend, and works in critical theory and the history of political thought. Has recently published a book called Political Responsibility that you simply must purchase if you haven't already. It's just a brilliant and erudite and challenging and polemical and deeply kind of scholarly defense of a political concept of responsibility that was published in 2016 by Columbia University Press. The work that he is presenting today is based on his new project and next project, or at least one of his next projects. The title of this paper is called A Singular Enlightenment, Universalism, Realism, and Utopia. And then Tyler Olson will present some comments on the paper after Antonio gives us his brief introduction.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. What I would like to do in the interest of time is to say a few words, not necessarily about the paper itself, since you had the paper, but more so about, what is it that it belongs and the context for this kind of intervention. As Robin mentioned, this is part of an ongoing long-term project of mine that it has something to do with a profound dissatisfaction on my part with some of the ways in which many of the debates within political theory about the relationship between Western and non-Western thought have unfolded. And I say that because in a way, I refuse to explicitly engage with this question for many years. As I often joke, I've been irritated into it. And hence a little bit the polemical edge of it. Because part of what I try to do in this project is to reclaim the transatlantic dimension of modern political theory, specifically so-called Western political thought. But in doing so, I enter into dialogue with several perspectives that are predominant these days, including mainstream post-colonial theory, but also colonial theory. And one of the things that I want to do is to suggest that there is a different way, a more critical way, a more politically enabling way of understanding how ideas travel, how ideas are and political concepts are misplaced, and challenge some of the assumptions that most accounts of travel and displacement, even colonialism, have. So it is in that context in which, after having very set ideas of what I thought or I think still, at any rate, that is wrong with some of the approaches that I mentioned, I also realized that it would be a more rewarding project for me to actually not only offer a critique of some of these approaches, but more importantly, try to suggest what the alternative that I'm defending looks like. And this paper, even though I've been teaching C.L.R. James forever, it seems, and even though I gave of the James Potter version of this years ago, actually Polly was my discussant, I decided to sort of go back to James as an attempt to try to illustrate, in a very limited way still, but to try to begin to illustrate what an alternative approach to the historicity of transatlantic political thought might look like, and what would be the kind of questions that it could yield, what would be the kind of concerns that it would present, and what kind of an interpretation one could offer from that perspective. And James, in a way, is an important object for these purposes for several reasons. And one of them is, of course, that there is a very prevalent reading of him, a very well-documented interpretation of him at the hands of David Scott, and that I think gets James distorted beyond recognition in my eyes. So in a way, it provided the perfect opportunity because I have a foil there that kind of participates in some of the post-colonial debates, and at the same time we have an object in common, a test, that is an author. And then I try to sort of articulate at a more historiographic, theoretical, conceptual level what I think is the most appropriate way to think about these questions, and then try to show it in James. Hence, the polemical part of the title, and that's the last thing that I'm going to say. A singular enlightenment. The initial impulse for that idea came from Jameson's account of a singular modernity. Part of it is because, again, something that I always struck me is how, within political theory, we are very suspicious of the language of pluralism, because it's maxed as liberalism, so on and so forth. And yet people are so uncritical in the way that they embrace the pluralization of concepts. Like suddenly we had, Scottish Enlightenment, French Enlightenment, English Enlightenment, Spanish Enlightenment, multiple enlightenments, so on and so forth. And for me, that pluralization is symptomatic of precisely a set of assumptions that are made about how ideas are shaped, forged, how concepts unfold, to use the kind of Hegelian language that I like to think about these things in history, and how they acquire and lose some of the determinations. So for me, part of the polemic here is that I want to say that the Enlightenment is one, and yet that doesn't make one into Eurocentric to say that, but more importantly, how James himself offers some of what is presupposed in European versions of the Enlightenment, as well as challenges, and enriches it. So that's part of what this chapter, which will be a chapter eventually, I mean, at least most of it will be a chapter of this book on transatlantic political thought, that is meant to be an intervention along the lines that I described. So you have the paper with you. I mean, I'm very fond of my epigraphs. They're there, and they're there for a reason, and I'm happy to discuss any questions that might emerge out of that. But obviously, I will, first of all, I look forward to hear the response to it.
Okay, so I just have some brief remarks. So the singular enlightenment, this idea about the singular, the particular, and the universal was particularly interesting to me, because that's what I've been trying to grapple with. What does it mean for something to be singular as opposed to particular, as opposed to universal? This is what I've been sort of struggling with for the past year or so. And I noticed when you first start describing what you mean by a singular enlightenment, you first say it is numerically discrete. Or, well, you don't say, that's my paraphrase, I'm sorry. You say it's one, it's a core set of principles. And so then by the particular, you seem to mean that this singular set of principles was formulated in a particular time and place in Europe in the 18th century. And by universal, the singular set of ideas that developed in a particular locale have a critical import that is not exhausted by its locus of origin. So there's a singular set of ideas that emerged in a particular time and place, a particular sociality. But these singular ideas that are embedded in a particularity do have universal import. And then that's like the first sense of singular that I saw. The second sense of singular was more like the singular context or location in which these ideas are deployed or enacted or laid claim to. So first there's the singular location in maybe revolutionary France, where you have a certain group of people coming together and making certain claims about freedom and equality and democracy. And in Haiti is a different context, where you have the colony, the slaves of these people who were claiming that they wanted to have these universal ideas. And this is a different context. And it's important to say that it's singular, I think, because it's not simply that it's a different particularity that's enacting something. It's singular because there's a whole new set of forces, and the transatlantic slave trade, all this sort of the colonial trade routes. They're all coming together in this one specific. You usually refer to as a concatenation of events that come together in this one moment. So on the one side, they're singular in the sense that there's just numerically one set of ideas. On the other side, it's singular in the sense of it's like the here now. It's you can't actually conceptualize this here now completely. So there's something that's not identical to the concept that is trying to understand it, that you're trying to understand it with. And the interesting thing to me is the way that this singular moment of Haitian Revolution leaves its mark on the universal concept. So the universal concept doesn't leave the Haitian context unchanged. And as you said in the beginning of your essay, the ideas and concepts and ideals these universal ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality that emerged in the Enlightenment, they were not fully formed or formulated or conceptualized adequately at their initial coherent appearance. And each singular appearance that occurs in a different unique context that can't be reduced to another one leaves its mark on this, and the universal idea does something else afterwards. So first I just noticed those two different ways that you were using the word singular, and I thought that was productive. And I was hoping that maybe you could comment on the way that you see the relation between singular and particular. Is particular merely just like a particularity in terms of like a particular identity category of people in a place, or is particular something else, or how's particular, singular, universal to you? And I have a couple other questions, but maybe we'll start with that one.
Oh, so we're gonna do it.
How should we do it? Should
I
we
think
do
you should just offer your remarks.
just offer all the okay?
Okay.
Okay. So the second thing that I wanted to bring out was you talk about the idea of negative universal history. Adorno says, there's not a universal history from, the savages to the humanitarian enlightened beings, but there's a history from the slingshot to the atom bomb. And so you're sort of drawing on Adorno in this idea of negative universal history, and you're indicating that progress is not guaranteed, and that there is sort of a sense in which progress is really only measured in terms of preventing catastrophe from happening again and again and again. And the way you describe it in this essay, you say that in this instance of negative universal history, not only is progress not guaranteed, but there is a transatlantic shared revolutionary heritage constituted by both conceptual and narrative determinations, and this particular revolutionary heritage is also world historical. So in one sense, there's a singular constellation of universal ideas that happen in Haiti as distinct from what happens in France. But on the other side, there's something like a shared transatlantic revolutionary heritage that maybe itself is also singular in a certain sense. The way this idea traveled and the way that it's been taken up in different places. So I just wondered maybe you could comment on the way you understand negative universal history and how that would relate to two different particularities coming together in one singular track. Third, one of the, as you mentioned in your opening comments, much of this essay is very much in response to a certain strain of post-colonial thought, very steeped in deconstruction and post-structuralist ideas. At the same time, I can't help but notice a great affinity with certain ideas from Derrida. And you did mention phallogocentrism at one point, so I figured Derrida was in your sights a little bit. But I mean, the idea for Derrida of citability and iterability, which are part of the structure of what he calls writing, which means that once something is written or laid down in some particular place, some singular inscription in some particular cultural place, for instance, the European Enlightenment ideals, once it's inscribed in the social, on the social body, it can be taken up and reinscribed and reinscribed in a new way and uttered differently and made to do different things. And it seems like this is a very productive relation between the particular social group that's reiterating it, and the universal idea that's being iterated. So it's rather than just an immanent critique in which you're criticizing reality and saying it doesn't stand up to the concept. It's an immanent critique in the way that Adorno would want it to be, where it's reciprocal. You criticize the reality because it doesn't measure up with the concept, and in that inscription, it also transforms the concept henceforth. Of course, Derrida doesn't use the word of concept and this sort of thing, but I think there's big similarities between what Derrida is talking about with writing and what's going on here with the singular iteration, the singular enacting the universal ideas newly. And I guess one last question, just less related to the text itself than maybe something that you might be able to help us with. So right now we're in a singular moment in the United States, and I'm just wondering, what lessons can we draw from history, from James's narrative of Haiti, from the Haitian Revolution itself? You point out that Scott tries to, he wants to craft a new narrative of colonial past in such a way that severs us when those passages we're in a new a new moment, he had a particular word, problem space, a new problem space. But I think that we're very much in the same sort of lineage. And in what ways can we draw on the various iterations of singular enlightenments enacted, universal ideas concretely enacted in various different spaces and contexts? In what ways can we link our current moment to past struggles to try to think about what we should do here and now?
Thank you. All right, those are big questions. And I wish I could get away with not dealing with the fourth one, but I will. Let me see. Maybe I can take long enough with the first three, so I can avoid the fourth. So singular. I think. First of all, thank you. That's a very thoughtful response, and I think you basically capture very and express very coherently the two senses of the singular that I've been trying to somewhat not playfully. But I've been trying to sort of like use the ambiguity of the word singular to precisely draw out both, right? Singular as even one, but also singular in terms of something unique, singularity, right? And you're absolutely right in linking that to this triad, universal, particular, singular. And honestly, the insight, to put it that way, that drives this whole thing is one section from concepts and categories in negative dialectic. And it's when Adorno emphasizes that you need to differentiate clearly between particularity and the particular. Because a particularity reduces the particular to the universal, an aspect of it, and something that is particular, there is a non-identity with the universal, right? And that if there is one formulation of negative dialectic that I think haunts everything that I have written, is precisely that. And I try to live up to that consistently. It's in my mind. And I remember the first time that I thought that I understood what was going on, it really struck me as very powerful. And that is part of the problem with these proliferations of enlightenments, for instance, has to do with something like that. Part of the problem of narratives, like the one that I discussed of the Jonathan Israels of the world, is precisely that then everything else becomes a particularity of the French process, right? So to understand the particular is also to understand the non-identical, and also making space for that other sense of the singular. So for me, that is very central in the ways in which we deal with any universal ideas or any manifestation of universality, the construction of universalities, which always, as you rightly pointed out, have a particular, and you can even say a very singular, one of the partial. And that's the other part of the argument, that in a way, kind of like, if I jump a little bit into the third question, in a way, very briefly, I'm gonna come back to it in more detail. It's one of the reasons that I sort of like, I can see how there is a certain resonance between these and certain positions of Derrida. It's not the first time that I'm told that I might be reintroducing Derrida through the back door, so to speak. You didn't put it that way, but there might be, that's been said to me before. But I think that the fundamental difference is precisely that I'm committed in this kind of Adornian way, but also very Hegelian way, to conceptual bindingness. And that's where what is not in Derrida. And I'm also committed to thinking about these iterations and this misplacement in materialist terms, in terms of history, with that as a referent, as opposed to assuming that in advance, or assuming that as an axiom, right? And here, of course, my biggest inspiration is one of the most Adornian writers that I know of, Roberto Schwartz, the Brazilian critic. And Schwartz coined in the late 70s this idea of this notion of misplaced ideas, that in a way does a wonderful job in precisely showing how when you put an idea in a different context, more than traveling, the idea gets misplaced. But in that misplacement, you understand something about what the idea presupposed in the first place that wasn't quite visible in the first articulation, but then you also see what gain in the process. And it's interesting because in this, I have an epigraph from one of his essays, National Adequation and Critical Originality, and in that essay, Schwartz precisely tries to work out exactly the differences between what will be a deconstructive approach or the construction Derrida-inspired approach to these questions, and what will be a more dialectical one. So in a way, that's how I try to think through these things, without necessarily making a fetish out of conceptual bindingness, but I think that that's what critical reason has. And without concepts, I just have a hard time of thinking of critical reason and critique, right? So in that regard, I try to understand concepts, and this is the other thing that I've been told, that maybe it's not so much Adorno, you're a neo-Hegelian and you just don't know it. I mean, I've been told that by Spensky and others. I mean, I don't care about the paternity of it, to be quite honest with you, or the branding. But for me, I mean, I think you can make the case out of Adorno. I think that I could make it. I think that you can make it out of in a Hegelian interpretation. Be that as it may, concepts do acquire determinations over time and in very concrete situations. And that is something that at an intuitive level, most people can probably assent to in this room. But when you actually follow the consequences of that, you realize that a lot of the critique of so-called Eurocentrism might be somewhat misplaced. A lot of the assumptions that people make about European categories, as I said, and you rightly capture, I mean, to assume that because first of all, sometimes practices that can be explained with a concept pre-exist the coining of a word. I suggested that with the term responsibility. Responsibility emerges only in the Romance languages in the 14th, 15th century. Aristotle had a concept of responsibility. He may not have a word, but he had a concept of it, right? So not only they precede that, but more importantly, even when they are coined initially, to assume that somehow that is a more originary moment, or, I mean, that's a kind of like also a Heideggerian conceit with etymologies that I just don't share, right? Because for me, it seems that sure, you might have come up with a word for the first time. That in of itself doesn't say anything. I mean, I just need to sort of like understand the social formation at the time, and then when I see that word moving or being invoked in different contexts, you have to sort of like reconstruct not only the different situation, but more importantly, and you mentioned this in your comments, how you got from one to the other. And this is where this notion, which is it's a mouthful in English, actually in Spanish it sounds quite elegant, concatenation. It's so important to me in thinking about this because it gives me a way to talk about causality while avoiding any forcing causality into any kind of teleology. I mean, things just, some things create openings and serve as conditions of possibility of others, right? And we reconstruct them usually retrospectively, but they are intelligible relations. Another part of this project, I tried to sort of like make those very explicit, how with these ideas that are also very specific political projects, and somebody like James himself, and that's the irony when you want to sever him from the present. I mean, James himself, when he wrote the preface in the 1930s, is thinking about Stalin, but he's thinking about Franco, right? And subsequently, when we look at him, and when we look at the dialectic of revolution and counter-revolution in the Atlantic, I mean, you have all kinds of very interesting connections to make there. From October all the way to the Spanish Civil War, through Cuba on one side, on the other side Franco, and then the juntas and the military dictatorships, which were in the model of him. So that both revolution and counter-revolution has that transatlantic dimension. Now, that's how singularity figures in it, and I think that you capture it, and I'm trying to play both meanings against each other to sort of like mine it, hopefully to some good effect. Universal history, negative universal history. I first started to think about this, and I actually, some of the people in the room, both Robin and Susan, were with me the first time that I started talking about this. I'm not gonna say when because it's gonna,
Biggest quote.
Yes, all of us, exactly. But the impulse for that is that when I first started reading Adorno many years ago, I was always fascinated by that formulation that you mentioned about universal history. And I was always fascinated about how there were all these arguments about provincializing this or that. But for me, maybe in a very pedestrian way, the initial question was a very obvious one. If you're going to provincialize some entity, it becomes a province of somewhere. So what is the overarching narrative? And it is in that context, and I'm happy to acknowledge that, especially because Susan is here, that then Hegel and Heidi came out. And it was funny because I always clung to the last formulation that a lot of the decolonials rejected, which is when you argue that they maybe when we think about this connection, we can then rethink universal history on a different basis. And for me, that was the big point, actually, a big payoff of the whole exercise, and I took my cue from that. And then except that rather than doing it, kind of like Benjaminian-inspired reconstruction, I tried to do it through Adorno, and try to draw that out, And there was an article published about that in 2008. And in a way, that is with me. Why do I reclaim it here? Because interestingly enough, in a recent work, Enzo Traverso, for example, has argued, very persuasively, I think, that if you look at some of James's other works, especially the book on Melville, Mariners and Renegades, the story of Melville, there are amazing parallels between how he narrates that and how the story of Odysseus, the Discursus and the Dialectic of Enlightenment is narrated. And then being the intellectual historian that he is, of course, he sort of like also is aware of the fact that Adorno and James met. We don't know what happened in those conversations, but we know that they had them here in New York. And he does this interesting counterfactual thing about, what was the misdialogue between, on the one hand, the transatlantic, like, Jewish exile, and on the other hand, the Black Atlantic. What were the interesting points of intersection? And even though I might disagree with, I might quarrel with Traverso here or there in terms of particular formulations, I think that he got that fundamentally right. And there is something to be said about how there is indeed something like a negative universal history in James's subsequent work. And it seems to me that one way, and this is what I'm somewhat ambivalent on, I thought that somebody might pick me up on this today. There's still a chance to be picked up on it, but let me preempt it. There is an ambivalence on my part, because part of me reads or understands Black Jacobins as a more radical version of what in the Enlightenment they refer to as enlightened histories, right? Something far more radical than Reynal, far more radical than Robertson, far more radical than the one that Pocock devoted a lifetime to, Gibbons, for example, so on and so forth. But then part of me also is persuaded by Césaire, who, talking about Toussaint Louverture himself, said this is all about reinserting a different universal in history. Really, really reconceptualizing universal history. And if we're going to cling to some version of that category, be it as a concept or as a narrative category, I think that it will be negative in the sense that it will refuse the positing of this teleology, this continuity that Adorno rejects, but at the same time makes a space for struggles that can yield forms of progress and force of agency. And that's the interesting thing. Like in the Odysseus Discursus in negative dialectic, I mean, basically, we know that he tied himself to the mast, and then the was is put in the ears, so they don't hear the song. In the case of James's version of Melville, it is actually the agency of those in the big boat that really matters. So it can be done in a kind of like more gloomy, pessimistic, hardening of the self, but it could also be done in a more emancipatory way. And you can account for both moments, I think, if you preserve something of that category. And then, I think that I already explained the Derrida relationship or lack thereof. and I don't know, and it's interesting, and this is the other thing that I will say. I gave another paper, a different proto-chapter of this project in McGill about a year and a half ago. And somebody also said, you're being Derridian and so on and so forth. And then, although that person was even bolder and accused me of indulging in the, narcissism of small differences or something of that effect. And, but there is something to be said about that, and I will embrace it. And what I will embrace is the following. I mean, there is something that Adorno's lectures have persuaded me over the years, is that sometimes where the differences seem to be so minimal, that's what they really matter. Mm-hmm. And I want to dwell on them. And I want to dwell on them because, in a way, I can see how, and this is something that has to be made more explicit in the context of the project, because I think that the fact that I hear this question for the second time is very symptomatic in of itself, right? It's something that I will take head on, but I think that it's very important to sort of like clarify exactly what those small differences are, because I think that that's what makes all the difference when it comes to engaging in this kind of work. Now, can I ask you, what do you mean about the present and past struggles? Well, to be more precise.
The present struggle, I guess, would be the United States government, which is like largely discredited. Nobody believes in it. No one has any faith that the people are actually being represented. This is not new. This has been going on for decades. But I mean, now with Donald Trump in office, it seems more urgent. Many people are very frantic about this moment. Yeah. And nobody really knows what to do. People are going in the streets and protesting. It doesn't really seem like it's doing anything.
Yeah.
So this, like, the present situation is just like the dysfunction, the illegitimacy of the representative system in not only the United States, but across the world. There's widespread, a crisis of confidence in democracy. Liberal democracy. And I guess the historical would be, because I understand that we're related to the whole history of, the people's history of the United States.
Yeah.
It's been written. There's all different struggles that we can look at and draw on. We can look at the struggle of Haiti and see how universal history was changed, But as scholars, we can look at that and we can draw the connections that we want, and we can write articles. But what does it amount to? How can we do something? How can we bring the present closer to the past and do something with it, rather than, I don't know, I feel totally impotent. All I do is write articles that nobody reads. And I'm just like wondering what we can do.
Listen, what can I say? I hear you. But beyond that, I mean, I think, it's just like, the only reason that I asked you to be more precise is that I don't want to carelessly sort of like jump from one to the other. And by that I mean that, I'm here concerned in a way, with, two different moments, if you wish, right? On the one hand, I'm trying to sort of like do justice to what James was trying to do. But I'm also trying to be mindful of what is it that James had in mind when he did it, because this was a deeply political intervention, which is what some people who read the book frequently forget, right? And more importantly, I'm also concerned with the politics of the people that sort of like, cut him down to size, so to speak, in the present, right? Now, I can say many things about the present moment, some of which probably you might not like, but they will not necessarily be related to the context, to the argument of this paper. Let me put it that way. I can say a few things about precisely what, this sense of despondency, this sense of impotence, this sense of mourning that many Americans have. I saw the other day somebody, and I didn't want to come across as a jerk, but the person says to me, I'm mourning the Republic. I said, well, you must have been in mourning for a very long time, right? In the sense that there is this, I'm more concerned, ironically, about how all these feelings that you're expressing have the effect of somehow normalizing or sandblasting a little bit the before, which I, coming from a part of the world similar to where James came from, I'm deeply concerned with, right? And the extent that there is a certain idealization of the predecessor because of the crassness and vulgarity and you name it, of the one here, but also the kind of like, and this is an ongoing argument. I guess that somebody can actually make the claim that there is a transatlantic dimension to the kind of rhetoric, the tropes that Trump brings to the forefront. I will be somewhat skeptical of that, but I'm open to hear it. Be that as it may, I think that it's also a question for people who engage in American political thought.